The day doesn't begin with noise or urgency, at least not in the way most people would expect, but it begins with a kind of quiet pressure that's already there before anything has even started, a pressure that sits in the back of his mind the moment he wakes up, because being a software engineer isn't about reacting to things you can see or touch. It's about solving things that exist entirely in logic, in systems, in invisible layers of code that only reveal themselves when something goes wrong. And so when he opens his eyes in the morning, usually sometime between 7 and 9, depending on how late he worked the night before, there's often no dramatic rush to get out of bed, no alarm followed by immediate action, but there is something else, something quieter, something more persistent, which is the awareness that there is unfinished work waiting for him, something unresolved, something that didn't quite behave the way it was supposed to the day before. And even before he reaches for his phone, even before he sits up, that awareness is already there, almost like a background process running continuously. And when he finally reaches over, grabbing his phone, checking notifications, emails, messages, there's confirmation of it, messages from teammates, comments left on code reviews, updates to tickets, questions that need answers, and even though the day hasn't officially started yet, the work has already begun in a way, because in this field, the systems don't stop running, the code doesn't stop existing, and problems don't pause just because someone is asleep. And so as he gets out of bed, moving slowly at first, walking into the kitchen, making coffee, there's this gradual shift happening. From being half aware of the work to being fully engaged in it, and even something as simple as waiting for the coffee to brew becomes a moment where his mind drifts back to the problem, replaying it, thinking about what might have gone wrong, what he might try differently today. And this kind of thinking doesn't feel forced. It happens naturally, almost automatically, because once you're deep into a problem like that, it doesn't fully leave you. It just waits for you to return to it. And as he sits down at his desk, whether that's in a quiet home office or at a workstation in a larger office environment, opening his laptop, logging in, pulling up his workspace, there's a very specific transition that happens, a shift from passive thinking into active problem solving, and the first thing he has to do isn't write code. It isn't fix anything immediately, it's rebuild context, because unlike work that's physical or visible, where you can simply pick up where you left off, software requires you to remember the structure, the relationships, the reasoning behind decisions that may have been made hours or even days ago, and that takes time. Opening files, reading through functions, scanning through logic, reminding himself why something was written the way it was written, why a certain approach was taken instead of another. And sometimes that process feels quick, and other times it feels slow, like trying to reassemble a mental map piece by piece. And as he scrolls through lines of code, stopping occasionally, rereading sections, there's a kind of quiet concentration that builds, not dramatic, not visible, but very real. And once that context begins to settle back into place, once things start to make sense again, that's when the real work begins. And even something as simple as a bug fix isn't simple at all, because what appears to be a small issue on the surface might be connected to something deeper, something less obvious. And so instead of jumping straight into a solution, there's a process, running the code, observing behavior, testing inputs, adding logs, stepping through execution one line at a time, watching how data moves through the system. And sometimes the issue reveals itself quickly, almost immediately, and those moments feel satisfying, like a quick win. But more often than not, it doesn't happen that way. More often, the problem resists, hiding behind layers of logic, requiring patience, requiring multiple attempts, trying one approach, seeing that it doesn't work, stepping back, thinking again, trying something slightly different, and this cycle repeats, not once, but several times. Sometimes many times, and with each iteration, there's a narrowing of possibilities, a gradual movement toward understanding, even if the solution isn't clear yet. And while all of this is happening, time is passing, quietly, almost unnoticed, and then eventually there's a stand-up meeting. A brief check-in with the team where everyone shares what they're working on, what progress they've made, what's blocking them, and even though it's short, even though it might seem routine, it serves a purpose because it reconnects everyone to the bigger picture, reminding him that the work he's doing is just one part of a much larger system, one that depends on coordination, on alignment, on communication, And once the meeting ends, it's back into the work, but now with slightly more clarity, slightly more direction, and as the hours move forward, there's a rhythm that begins to form. A pattern of focus, test, adjust, repeat, where each cycle brings him a little closer to solving the problem, even if it doesn't feel that way immediately. And there are moments where frustration builds, where nothing seems to work, where every attempt leads to another dead end, and in those moments, there's a decision to be made, to either push harder or to step back briefly, to reset, to give the mind a moment to breathe before diving back in. And often it's in those moments, after stepping away for even a short time, that something shifts, that a new idea forms, that a different perspective emerges, and returning to the code with that new perspective can make all the difference. And eventually, slowly, the problem begins to give, the behavior starts to make sense, the fix begins to take shape, and as he implements it, carefully, deliberately, testing along the way to make sure nothing else breaks, there's a sense of progress, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, and by the time the first half of the day comes to an end, there's already been a significant amount of effort invested, a significant amount of thinking, even if the final result isn't fully complete yet, because in this field, progress isn't always about finishing something, it's about moving closer, step by step, to something that works. As the day moves further into the afternoon, there isn't a clean break or a clear transition from one phase of work to another, but there is a noticeable shift in how everything feels, because by this point, a significant amount of mental energy has already been spent, a significant amount of focus has already been applied, and even though the work itself continues in the same way, writing code, testing logic, solving problems, there's now an added layer that sits quietly underneath it all, which is fatigue. Not the kind of fatigue that makes you want to stop immediately, but the kind that makes everything just slightly heavier, slightly slower, where each new problem requires just a little more effort to fully engage with. And even though he's still sitting at the same desk, looking at the same screen, interacting with the same system, the experience begins to change in subtle ways, because maintaining that level of concentration for hours at a time takes a toll. And yet at the same time, there's still work that needs to be done, still problems that need to be solved, still decisions that need to be made, and so there's no real option to disengage. Instead, there's an adjustment, a kind of internal recalibration where he leans into the work differently, becoming more deliberate, more careful, because mistakes at this stage are easier to make, and those mistakes can create more work later, which only adds to the cycle. And so as he looks at the code in front of him, whether it's continuing the same problem from earlier or shifting to something new, there's a slightly slower pace to the way he approaches it, not rushed, not careless, but measured, thinking through each step before taking it, rereading lines more than once, double-checking assumptions that earlier in the day might have felt obvious. And as he continues working, there's often a shift from exploration to refinement, where instead of trying to figure out what's wrong, he's now trying to improve what already works, cleaning up logic, simplifying conditions, making the code easier to read, easier to understand, because in software engineering, clarity is just as important as functionality, and something that works but is difficult to understand can become a problem later. And so this part of the process becomes less about solving a mystery and more about shaping the solution into something solid, something reliable, something that won't create confusion for someone else in the future. And as he moves through this refinement, there are still moments where new issues appear, small things that weren't obvious before, edge cases that weren't initially considered, and those moments pull him back into problem-solving mode again, requiring him to pause, to think, to adjust. And this back and forth between solving and refining continues, not in a straight line, but in cycles, each one adding a layer of stability to what he's building. And throughout all of this, communication continues in the background. Messages from teammates, questions, clarifications, feedback on code that was submitted earlier, and each of those interactions requires its own kind of attention, because explaining code, discussing logic, or reviewing someone else's work involves shifting perspective, stepping out of your own thought process and into someone else's. And that shift, even though it might seem small, requires effort, because it means holding multiple viewpoints in your mind at the same time, understanding not just what you're doing, but how it connects to what others are doing. And as the afternoon continues to stretch into later hours, there are moments where things begin to click again, where the effort starts to pay off, where the code behaves the way it's supposed to, where the system responds correctly, and those moments bring a kind of quiet satisfaction, not loud or dramatic, but real, because they represent progress. They represent movement forward, and even though that progress might not be visible to anyone outside of this process, it matters because it means the system is becoming more stable, more complete, more functional, and as he continues working, there's always a decision in the background, a quiet question of how far to push, whether to keep going and try to complete one more piece, one more improvement, or to start winding things down, because unlike more structured jobs, there isn't always a clear endpoint. There's always something more that could be done, something else that could be improved, and that can make it difficult to stop, because stopping doesn't always feel like finishing. It often feels like pausing in the middle of something, and yet there's also an awareness that mental energy has limits, that pushing too far can lead to mistakes that will need to be corrected later. And so as the day begins to move toward its end, there's a gradual shift in focus from building it to closing, committing changes, saving progress, updating tickets, writing notes to capture what was done and what still needs to be addressed, because documentation becomes important here. Not just for others, but for himself, for tomorrow, so that when he comes back, he doesn't have to rebuild everything from scratch again. And as he goes through this process, there's a sense of partial completion, not because everything is finished, but because something has been moved forward, something has been improved. Something is now closer to working than it was before, and as he finally steps away from the computer, there's a noticeable transition, but it isn't immediate because the mind doesn't simply switch off. The problems don't disappear. The moment the laptop closes, they linger. They continue running in the background, just like they did in the morning, sometimes resurfacing unexpectedly. A thought about a better solution, a different approach, a small detail that might need to be revisited. And even as the evening begins, as he moves into a more relaxed environment, there's still a connection to the work, a thread that hasn't been fully cut yet. And gradually over time, that connection fades, replaced by rest, by distance. But never completely gone, because in this line of work, the problems have a way of staying with you. Not in a burdensome way, but in a persistent one, always there, waiting to be picked up again. And as the night settles in, as fatigue becomes more apparent, there's a quiet understanding that the cycle will repeat, that tomorrow will bring another set of problems, another set of solutions. Another series of decisions that will shape something that didn't exist before. And even though the work can be demanding, can be mentally exhausting, it also carries a sense of creation, because at the end of it all, something has been built, something has been improved, something has moved forward, and that, more than anything, is what defines the life of a software engineer.